Hi, everyone. Welcome to Waste 360's Nothing Wasted podcast. On every episode, we invite the most interesting people in waste, recycling, and organics to sit down with us and chat candidly about their thoughts, their work, this unique industry, and so much more. So thanks for listening and enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. This is Liz Bothwell from Waste 360 with Erin Simon, head of plastic waste and business at World Wildlife Fund, and we'll refer to it as WWF. Hi, Erin, and thanks for being on the show today.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
So we normally start at the beginning, so could you just tell us about your background and how you ended up at WWF?
Absolutely. I don't think I ever had intended to end up at WWF or an NGO. It really hadn't been in my vision, but it's interesting how our different life choices get us to where we are and sort of plop us down in, I think, what turned out to be a really perfect place for me. But I started out at Michigan State University in the School of Packaging, and so I got my engineering degree in packaging and material science, and was hired right out of school into Hewlett-Packard in Boise, Idaho, to help develop and design packaging for large format printers. So those are the printers that would be like in a copy room in a business, in an office building, if we still went to those. And then 5 years into that, transferred to Richmond, Virginia to, and let's be clear, I didn't transfer for work. I followed a boy, which I don't like to advocate for, but it happened, so those are things. And I continued working with HP, but in supplies, in photo paper and inkjet. And it was interesting, as I got more into my career and I learned more, I realized that as a material scientist, I spent a lot of time thinking about how I could use these materials to improve the consumer experience, to make our lives easier, to make things more convenient. But I didn't spend as much time really focusing on the impact or the cost of those materials when I sourced them to the planet, communities, or the impact of what happened when they were not really efficiently managed at end of life. And I happened to be in conversations with an organization called World Wildlife Fund around another topic, which happened to be pulp and paper. HP was exploring the opportunity to become a member of the Global Forest and Trade Network, which is a program that WWF hosts to help companies to understand where their products that are forest-based products come from, and how they're managed, and ensuring sort of the sustainable future of those well-managed forests for their products. And so I sat on the other side of the table as one of the key partners at HP, helping to pull all this data and figure out how we could, build more transparency into our pulp and paper sourcing, and how we could, meet an ambition that WWF set for GFTN members, but also become a member of that group by having the right commitments and level of engagement. And so I got to know a lot of the folks at WWF, and had conversations with them about the broader material lens, saying it's really important that you're looking at these things for all materials, not just pulp and paper, and was introduced to a man named Jason Clay, who at that time led up all of our markets work, and he's like, we just need you to come here and create a program for how we engage with companies more broadly on packaging material science. And so in a whirlwind of having a baby, moving to Washington, D.C., and starting a new job, about 10 years ago, I joined WWF to lead the work to engage with companies and think differently about how they were sourcing, using, designing, and then recovering materials. And I've now been there. I'm going to have my 10th anniversary this summer as a Panda, and the work has grown and expanded, and as of late, especially since the 2015 JAMBEC study, really has the level of ambition and therefore the impact, the higher impact of the work that we are driving through engaging with companies to help them be more effective in delivering on their ambitious commitments in a really meaningful, measurable way. So it's been a wild ride, but it's been good. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, that's great. And I love your story, and it's great to hear that you really are a material scientist and you came here with that in mind, and that's the work you're doing.
Yeah, it helps having those conversations when you kind of came from that side and knew what it was like, and also have the technical experience with the conservation lens. So
absolutely. And I've read about I think it's a somewhat recent hub that you all launched called World Wildlife Fund's Resource Plastic. Can you tell me about that? That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's so as I touched on, in 2015 that science came out that Jen and Jen Beck did, and it said that it really helps us to all come together around the fact that we were not addressing all of the issues of the broken system historically when we were trying to address plastic waste. We were asking companies to make it more recyclable and use more recycled content, but we weren't really honing in on the other key stakeholders and the full scope of work that needed to be done to fix that broken system. And so as that science emerged and as these ambitious commitments started to get made by both companies and governments, these companies would come to us and say, "Hey, Erin, am I getting this right? I'm doing these things, or is that what I need to do?" And it was this moment where I was like, well, I'd love to be able to give you that information, but I need to understand better what your impact is, where your footprint is, to be able to say that the things you're doing are leading to reducing the impact that you have on the plastic waste problem. And so we saw a gap in all of the activities that were happening, in that while companies had really raised the level of ambition of what they wanted to do, there was no clear roadmap for how they were going to get there. And so WWF launched Resource Plastic as the implementation hub to move from that ambition to, meaningful change that we could measure and could move to scale a lot quicker. The key fundamentals of that are by helping companies to measure what their footprint is, right, through the plastic footprint tracker that we established. It's a tool that helps them to look at, what they're sourcing, what is it made of? Is it recycled content? Is it sustainably sourced bio-based? Is it virgin? What is it being made into, format, polymer type, and where does it go in the world? Where we've built out a fate model to say what happens to it. Is it reused, recycled, composted? So therefore, we're getting those resources back, or is it landfilled? Is it incinerated, or is it mismanaged? Meaning there's a likelihood that they could end up in nature where we don't want them to be. And so from there, you can really help a company to develop a strategic plan for how they're going to really reduce their impact, really manage their plastic waste impact. And by doing that in the same way as their peers and others in the plastic supply chain, plastic value chain, they can not only see their role in it, but they can see they're part of the whole. Because as was identified early on, the plastic waste system is broken, and so it requires systems change. It almost requires this, every single stakeholder that has a role to play to do their part and do it in a coordinated way. And that's hard to do if you don't have a full visual picture of what's happening in the system. And so Resource Plastic really creates that clear data-driven path for companies to engage in that. So we launched that in 2019. Sorry, time is hard these days. I can't remember where I am and what I'm doing anymore. And then in 2020, we launched the first inaugural report. So this was the first 5 companies that participated in it, which were Coke, P&G, Starbucks, McDonald's, and Keurig Dr. Pepper. And so those 5 companies agreed to pilot this reporting tool with us, which is a big deal because you really pulled back the curtain on what's happening in their plastic waste footprints and made that public in this first report. But it allowed us to showcase for the first time ever, shared challenges, shared opportunities, and also provide a baseline so that year over year we can report on progress. And ultimately, our hope is that by 2030, those 5 companies plus, 95 of their closest friends will be showcasing an improvement of, over 50 million metric tons of reduced mismanaged waste, right? we really want to be able to tie the actions that they're taking into actually direct on-the-ground impacts of less waste. So it's been really great, and that program is really kind of a part of a larger suite of activities we're doing to coordinate all of the actions that are happening in the global waste crisis to make sure that the companies are engaging with the policymakers on the good policies that are needed to change the systems, and they're engaging with consumers, and they're activating work on the ground so that there's this cohesive sort of set of interventions that are driving us towards the progress we all want to see.
That's great. That is so action-oriented, and the data is there to back it up. Did you have any challenges, like standardizing the data for each company or the language that was being used? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I absolutely can. And I almost just laughed when you said, "Do you have any challenges?" I'm like, oh my gosh, so many, right? So there's two main buckets of challenges. One was that first thing you highlighted, which was standardizing data for companies to put in, right? You have to have apples to apples in the tool. And so there was, to get that, you have to pull it from their existing systems, whether that's like an SAP or an Oracle, right? Even within these large multinational companies, the way they fill out their bill of materials is not the same from country to country, right? And so that having a discussion with them around how to input the data into the tool in the first place and get that standardized, it's a big lift for the companies to do that. It's just a lot of data management. Second of all, we really didn't want to do this in a vacuum. We wanted to do this in partnership with other organizations that were driving progress in a similar way, but just didn't have this sort of methodology for accounting set up. And so Ellen MacArthur Foundation had come out of the gate early on with this global commitment program that really required companies to set ambitious targets, but it didn't have a required methodology for how they accounted for what they reported on year over year. And so we really partnered up with them to make sure we were matching on terms and definitions. And that's been a real consistent effort, not just with Ellen MacArthur and WWF, but, UNEP, Greenpeace, the PACs, World Economic Forum, all these other institutions that are talking in the same way or talking around metrics and reporting. We've really been pushing just sort of standardized language of how we talk about these things so that we're all speaking the same language in a way to be more effective in directing change. And so getting alignment on that takes a lot of coordination and stakeholder management, but then also getting companies to find the capacity internally to do that reporting was, an additional challenge. So we continue to work on that, and I honestly think the rigor of data reporting that we are doing in Resource is going to continue to challenge that. We have moved to a web-based tool now. Last year's report was based off a lovely set of Excel spreadsheets and some very manual analysis, but we have now moved to a more automated system in a web platform, which I think will also help with some of that. The second challenge on data was around fate modeling. As you are probably well aware, the way countries report on fate, if they report at all, is vastly different. And what I mean by fate is what happens to waste in their country, right? How are they reporting on landfilling? How are they reporting on recycling? Recycling rates may mean how much was collected in one country, and it may mean how much was actually processed in another. And that can be really challenging for navigating what's actually happening on the ground in a way to effectively, intervene, whether that's through a design or material change or a new business model, or whether that's through policy or investment in infrastructure. And so we worked with an organization called Thesis, sorry, I got that wrong, to help us to develop a model that looked at the best available data we had right now on what was happening globally, and then to essentially extrapolate based on what we could about what was happening where we didn't have information, and then to rate that data for representativeness. Is this really good data or is it not? And that can all be pulled together. So as you look at the final results, understanding what does that tell us right? We want to directionally start moving companies towards reduced impacts. So the representativeness of that data is really important. We are continuing to study different reports on fate and mismanagement rates globally that are being put out by different scientific institutions, and looking at which ones have the best available information or the most representative to, to replace the data within our model with. And then we're continuing to push from a policy perspective, both nationally and globally through the Global Treaty, for more real-time reporting of actual information versus models, so that countries are reporting on what's happening to their waste, and companies are reporting on what products they're putting into the waste stream in order for us to have a much clearer picture. So it's sort of multifaceted in trying to address the data quality challenges that we all face these days. But, overall, we haven't let that barrier slow us down, because we don't have time to wait for the data to be perfect for us to start taking action.
Absolutely. And like you said, you're improving as you go. A year or so in,
Yep.
You're already automating the data part that you're working on. So, progress is good, right? That's what matters.
Yeah.
You referenced this slightly, but you have so much going on, and another big part of what you're working on is the Plastics Pact. And this one I'd love to hear more about. This one makes me optimistic, because this is one that I feel can definitely work and get the traction it needs. So please, can you unpack that a little bit?
Absolutely. So what was one of the interesting results coming out of the Transparent Report last year, in the midst of WWF already agreeing with Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the Recycling Partnership that a U.S. Plastic Pact makes sense, was that these 5 companies that reported out found that a big part of their footprint was actually in the U.S. And a large part of that was because they're multinational companies that are headquartered in the U.S., and the U.S. is one of the largest consumer bases in the world, and 75% of our plastic waste is ending up landfilled, right? So it's just they've got a lot going in there, and it's not getting recovered in the form of reuse, recycling, or compost. And so it almost was sort of perfect timing, right, for companies to realize they needed to do some full-on collective action in the U.S. that would require an overhaul of the municipal solid waste system, and they knew that they couldn't do it on their own, but they were going to depend on it a lot for actually being able to meet their goals, right? So we launched the U.S. Plastic Pact, as I said, in partnership with TRP and EMF in August. And at that time, I think we had 60 members, 70 members, and now we're up to almost 90. And the purpose of that is to set out to look at how all of the stakeholders in the plastic value chain, NGOs, cities, companies alike, can come together to collectively align on the goals for what we want that system to look like, and play their role in getting there to make those systems changes. This is the action on the ground, like you said about. This is where it gets really exciting, right? Where we, and it's what was really powerful and exciting about it, or still is that these companies came to the table with a demand, an ambition, and at the forefront of that, they wanted policy and policy for form in the U.S. to be a big piece of this. And you are obviously working in this space well aware that historically companies in the U.S. have not been super excited about a lot of policy around, extended producer responsibility, deposit return systems, because historically those did not roll out really well in the U.S. and were pretty fragmented, and so they often lobbied against them. But the realization that they needed really solid and consistent policy that not only funded the infrastructure but helped to modulate what goes into it, and the quality levels and investment in infrastructure and in technology and collection and access and in consumer behavior engagement. That's really powerful, because we've got this. We're developing the roadmap right now for how this group of 90 members is going to deliver on their amazing targets by 2025, which are around figuring out what's not going to work in the collective system, right? What are we going to say is problematic? And that means that you either stop making it, or you figure out a new business model for it, or you figure out a closed system to recover it, right? Then it also pushes that we have design requirements for what technical recyclability, compostability, reuse standards those products need to meet if they're going to be in the system, so that we can get to 100% reusable, compostable, and recyclable. Obviously, that provides the right inputs into the system, and so we need the system to raise up. So the goal is by 2025 to get to a 50% recycling rate. Very ambitious, the policy requires the modulation, the design standards, and the funding mechanisms to get us there. And then on the back end of that is that there's a commitment to move to the 30% recycled or sustainably bio-based content as the source. And so where those are really ambitious targets, and each company on their own would not be able to achieve them, they feel a lot more security in the fact that we're going to win and lose together on this one, right? And we all want, ultimately, those targets to come to fruition and for us to honestly surpass them if possible. And so the commitment in the pact is to take the actions as an individual stakeholder to do that. WWF is really supporting and pushing on the policy side of that. And also, obviously, on the reporting, we are going to be using the resource footprint tracker as a mechanism to report on the progress of the pact year over year, and make sure that we are delivering on those commitments in an effective way. So, yeah, it's really exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing what this group can collectively do together. I'm going to be honest; it's going to be hard work, though, because agreeing with each other is always the first step on how you do that when you get to the nitty-gritty, right? So,
absolutely, it gives me hope because it seems to be the most complete pact that we've seen so far, and the fact that the commitments are there and the goals and targets are there as well. I do have a question about that. Is there an organization that's overseeing the design standards at the beginning of life of these products? How are you measuring that?
Yeah, so there is within the pact, there is a number of work streams that are sort of helping to develop the roadmap, which will be launched April or May. And that roadmap has the details of how we're going to essentially deliver on each of those 4 targets in sort of the multifaceted approach. One of the key areas of that is design for recyclability and design for reuse. And so the design for recyclability piece is a multi-stakeholder group of select members within the pact who are helping to create those guidelines and references for, and they're doing that in concert with a group that's sort of looking at the list of problematic items, and the group that's looking at the policy, and the group that's looking at, scope and data and metrics and measurement. World Economic Forum is working on a set of guidelines with another multi-stakeholder group on reuse in general, design guidelines, safety guidelines, and a city playbook. And so the pacts are looking to adapt those guidelines to help with the establishment of the reuse systems, because as we know, the same way we have to really make sure the full systems, collection, processing, and then secondary markets for recycling are available, we need to have that same thing for reuse systems and being able to actually reuse these really resource-intensive materials in a way that brings the impact down to the level we're looking for. It's sort of a combination of pulling in existing expertise from other multi-stakeholder platforms and advocating for it, or establishing a clear map of what exists in the landscape around recycling design guidelines already and what we need in order to get the system where we want it to be. So a clearer roadmap for that will launch this spring, though, to help give everybody a good idea of what the next steps are.
Oh, that's great. Okay, I will watch for that for sure. And I know you mentioned EPR in addressing the issue of plastic waste, and I know the U.S. struggles with that a bit, and we look to Europe and Asia and even Canada for good examples of this. How important do you think this is now?
I think there is quite strong alignment from, I would say the most progressive groups to even some of the more conservative ones, that EPR in some form will be a key element of a national legislative system in the U.S. in order for the systems change that we need, right? I think what's really exciting is where EPR traditionally talks about just a funding mechanism. What is being discussed these days in sort of that larger set of diverse stakeholders is not just the funding mechanism, but how does policy enable the ultimate system that we're looking to see, right? We want a system where no matter where you are in the U.S., you have a blue bin. And it's really easy for you to put things in that blue bin because there's no sort of decoder ring required. It either goes in the blue bin or it doesn't. And everybody's blue bins has the same things that go in it, right? And so then you have these facilities that these blue bins are collected and sent to that all have the right sorting and processing technologies to be able to manage those materials that go in the blue bin. And therefore, on the back end of that, you have these really high-quality secondary markets to be sourced from. And so to do that, right, you need to have policies that enable all of those points, whether it's around the design considerations, the access and consumer engagement, the infrastructure and funding for that, or even the enabling of the secondary markets. Those we want to have a much more complete and holistic policy plan that's out there. And so that's where the discussion is, where EPR is a key piece of that, but it's sort of beyond just EPR, if that makes sense.
It definitely does. And I love how you look at everything with a holistic approach. And I know that you recently wrote something, I think it was January, about the idea of plastic crediting to kind of help this piece of the broken value chain around the waste management side of this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think what we have, you always see a lot of innovation and ideas emerge as different organizations are trying to help be a part of finding solutions to these global crises. And as we've seen in other areas, the idea of credits came out as something that was being explored. And WWF has long been a part of the debate and dialogue around credits in the carbon space. And so we wanted to look at, what are the same risks that we could be seeing when we're thinking about the plastic waste credit system. And so what's been interesting, though, is that WWF is currently cautious, right, about plastic crediting because there's really not sufficient standards and safeguards for the process, and there's potential to enable companies to make claims about actions without actually making any substantial changes to their businesses and causing potential greenwashing and therefore environmental and social risk. And so what we did see is that we came out and said we see plastic crediting as a potential additional approach to plastic reduction strategies if there could be strong and credible standards that we could sort of govern that. If there could be strong social and environmental safeguards upheld, this is always a challenge. And then, of course, the claims and the way we're telling the story is supported by the footprinting, transparent footprint reporting, meaning that it's in addition to the work you're already doing to clean up your own house. What we wanted to do is make sure that we came out and started to position the concerns and risks associated so that any further development of standards that were being were in progress would be thinking about safeguarding against these risks, making sure that they are considering those challenges as they're developing their standards so that they don't get out and put out a standard that sort of misses that. Another piece of that was we sort of wanted to draw a line in the sand around this idea of plastic neutrality. We don't support the use of terms like plastic neutral or plastic neutrality because they don't really clearly convey the environmental impact. We also wanted to say that we don't think that net zero is a great concept in this space. It's a systems concept, right? But it's not a term that should be applied to individual products or materials, especially when there's no current strong consensus on the definition of it. So we don't want people to be misled. There's already enough complexity and confusion in this space, and so we want to make sure that it's easy for folks to understand what's happening. So really, I think the plastic crediting space has got a lot of growth, and so we will continue to try to keep that lens for making sure that the net impact that we're looking to see with those credits is actually happening versus something that is sort of murking the waters further, if that makes sense.
It definitely does. And so, I mean, you know this better than anyone. The world is paying closer attention to plastics these days, from the emotional images we've all seen with wildlife and nature. Do you think this additional exposure has helped brands come to you and other groups to help with this challenge?
Yeah, it's been the momentum and the speed at which companies and governments are raising their ambition is really sort of fascinating. It's for conservation organizations like ours. It's been really sort of the perfect storm to allow us to push for the level of change we need to see as quickly as we do, because there's such urgency to this one. I mean, especially if you think about the latest statistics around the Pew report around what would happen with business as usual, right? 2 times the plastic production, meaning 3 times the leakage into the ocean, and therefore 4 times that just what's there today persisting there. And that's, so those images, right, what's been so, and I hate to even use this term, what's been so fantastic about an image of a turtle with a straw in its nose, or a gut-wrenching image of an animal that has been directly impacted by plastic through entanglement or ingestion, is that universally we all have the same reaction, right? We look at that and we say, that is not how it should be. Why is that there? It does not belong there. And so it's when you're trying to get engagement from all these stakeholders, when you're trying to make a case for their involvement, one part of it is them understanding that they have a role to play in solving it, but another is providing them with the opportunity to be empowered because they have a role to play. And, where the climate crisis is harder to tangibly figure out what your role is, for the first time ever, the general public could stop using a straw and be a part of the solution right away. Even though that was really, that was more, so it was less impactful, right? The straw movement was just the tip of the iceberg, but it allowed them to feel really engaged and a part of the solutions, and so hungry for more. And I think you see that not just with individuals, but you see that with governments who are being held accountable by those individuals, and companies who, are really there's a lot of pressure on them to help be a part of solving this problem. And so all of that public pressure has definitely accelerated things, along with just the cohesive way that its science has advanced to give us, those, the key statistics that say, here's what's going to happen if we don't do this, right? It's a hot mess, folks. And so I think that's been really powerful. And we're also just, you get that tipping point of companies, of a certain number of companies leading out with that ambition. And at some point, if you're not with them, then what are you doing, right? So, we've been, I think, incredibly lucky to have that momentum in the plastic crisis, because it has definitely allowed our strategy to evolve at a pace that is closer to what we need it to be to actually get out ahead of this problem before it causes irreparable damage to species and ecosystems, and then, of course, communities.
Definitely. So how has the pandemic affected your work and the work at WWF?
I have been, thinking about this a lot, because we get the question a lot, but also because it's such an immersive experience, right? Whether we wanted it or not. For one, there's a lot of work that my team is doing to advance the science and the credibility of our work and get more companies involved, and that has been moving forward without a lot of impact. But a lot of what we do is stakeholder engagement and getting together with people and building consensus. And we've had to do all of that in this virtual space, right? I would argue that we're, as a larger community, getting much better at that. But I don't know that we totally know what the impact of the loss of that is. But I think what you're still seeing is progress on the topics and progress on ambition. Early on, as the pandemic took hold and we saw a lot more medical waste out in nature and in communities, there was this fear that the problem was just getting so much worse, and therefore, it was gonna really stall out on our ability to make progress. But what that really helped to build more transparency into was the fact that, what we see happening is a new source of waste entering an already broken system, that they're, just helping to highlight the urgency of getting to fixing it, whether that's through policy or through, company engagement and action. And then, of course, consumer engagement empowered by all of that. Another challenge that hit that I was a little bit concerned about was the oil price, when, it's already pretty, it's cost prohibitive right now for recycled content or sustainably sourced bio against virgin. And the price of oil going down only exacerbates that issue, right? It's so cheap to make virgin plastic. And so I was worried that companies were going to want to back off of their recycled content targets or their, the role they were playing. And that actually did not happen. Now, that hasn't happened yet. I'm not going to be able to predict the future, and I don't have control of these companies. But so we continue to look at cost parity and how cost parity with virgin is a limiting piece of the system's change, right? It has to be addressed whether through policy or other mechanisms. I think the other, and so that's something that we're keeping an eye on. And then finally, reuse itself was something that people shied away from. And when we look at the strategy, we know that reuse has got to be new business models in general, like delivering things in a different way that are not single use. It's something that is an area that needs to grow, and that system needs to be developed in order for the innovation and the solutions to fall into it. And what I mean by system, it's like I mentioned earlier, the fact that we have to have a way to actually reuse those things, and we have to have consumer engagement and incentive to get them back, and and we have to be able to meet safety and design protocols in order to do all that. There needs to be policy, and so we have to build that as we innovate in that space. And so honestly, the pandemic gave us some time when there wasn't a proliferation of solutions being piloted to really step back with that group at World Economic Forum and build those guidelines out, start to put some of those safeguards in place ahead of that to raise awareness around what designers, companies, cities, and others need to be thinking about as they're putting those things into place. So I'm not going to say the pandemic has been good by any means, but we are pretty agile and continue to drive the mission forward, because we know that those barriers, those challenges are going to continue to arise in the future, and we just have to be really resilient in the way we think about working to continue to make progress in the meantime.
Absolutely. And I love that you talked about the cost parity and how that needs to be addressed, and creating in markets, because that will fix the recycling system as well and push it along.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So as you know, a lot of our listeners are waste and recycling folks, and they're tasked with handling this massive amount of plastic in the system at its end of life. Do you have any advice for them?
I think they have this really powerful role to play, because they provide an opportunity for a next life of those materials, right? So I think they have a huge opportunity to influence the discussions that are being had right now, right, around design standards. What do they want in their system? Helping to think about and work with entrepreneurs or technology companies on technologies that they could utilize that would increase efficiency and materials, what we get out of that recycling system, quality and quantity. to be a part of thinking about how we can engage in communities better, to, and to get the public excited about this and encouraged and aware of the role that they can play. They do not need to be just somebody that the materials are thrown over a wall to without communication. They have power to sort of be a part of that dialogue and think collectively of how they can do it, right? They do. One thing I want to encourage is for them to also look similarly to the way that you see users of plastic changing their view, which is that we can't allow just economics to be the only driving factor, right? So right now, tipping fees into landfills are pretty inexpensive, and so, but there is an environmental cost that's not being accounted for. And so, how can they help push that? I'm not saying that I need them to go out of business in the process, right? I know they need to keep their doors open and their staff paid, but how can they help us figure out the right levers or the right standards that need to be set or the right policies that to be put in place to help enable them to do that, enable them to be conscious of both the environmental and economic costs of waste, so that we can keep it in the system and use it again and again. But yeah, they belong at the table with a very powerful voice, like everyone else.
Definitely, and it's great to hear that there is a seat at the table, and I think that has been their complaint over the years with recycling labels that haven't worked and things like that. Just to get them at the table before the product is produced will save everybody time, energy, money, and get the end result what we all hope for.
Yeah, exactly.
So what else are you paying attention to? Not that you're not busy enough, Erin, but what else are you working on?
Well, a couple of things this year on top of all that. One is, as we think about this national policy play and really how the U.S. system has a huge opportunity, we're also looking at the global stage, right? How can we think about and support member states bringing to the UN General Assembly next year a global treaty to address plastic waste? How can we think about, because what that does is it creates consistency, right, for companies hoping to invest globally, consistency in the way we're measuring each country's waste and material flows, commitments by these countries to address their plastic waste problem, to invest in infrastructure, to put policies in place to help enable the recovery of those materials and to regulate that. The WWF is really supporting this larger dialogue in partnership, actually, with Greenpeace and Ocean Plastic Leadership Network around how we can bring together all the key value chain players around support and establishment of the right elements of what a global treaty for plastic waste would look like over the next year. So Ocean Plastic Leadership Network is going to be hosting some dialogues this year to help create some clarity in the different institutions and parts of the value chain's priorities and what's going to be really an enabling function and then rolling out into the national level discussion. These things are going to be a feedback loop to one another. While the global treaty would take a while to get into place, in the meantime, that the more national legislation and infrastructure development will be in progress. And so I think it's really important that you're influencing those in a really cohesive way so that metrics and measurement are using the same standard terms and definitions, for example, and that the policy and reforms pushed out at a global level will work for the diverse set of countries and communities that it needs to enable and support. So a lot of exciting work on thinking about that, and the U.S. could be really, really powerful in those discussions, and could be and has a real great opportunity to just look in its own borders on how we fix our own system, as I mentioned before. So the other area we're really focusing on is connecting the plastic waste footprinting to environmental impact. So I talked earlier about how we're looking at plastic waste footprints for companies. And what that is measuring is loss of opportunity, right? Loss of resources. It's not measuring the environmental impact because of the loss. And the climate discussion is going to be a priority for this administration, and connecting the interventions and the decisions we make around solutions to address the plastic waste problem to their climate impact or climate benefit is really important. So we're going to be continuing to push on really thinking about how we advance the science on that, and being able to understand that better so we can empower companies with that knowledge to be able to utilize that in making better decisions. So we do some work on that, and continuing to be a voice around the bioplastic discussion. Bioplastics came up, sort of emerged back in the early 2010, 2011, on the heels of some of the missteps we took with biofuels. And WWF launched a program called the Bioplastic Feedback Alliance back in 2013, I think. I should know this because I actually was the one who launched it. And it really set up to help companies think about, what they need to consider. What are the risks associated with sourcing bio-based materials for making into plastics? What are the land use concerns, the food security concerns? How do they think about biodiversity and water and chemical use when they hadn't been thinking about that before when sourcing from, oil or natural gas? So we've been doing that work for a long time, but it has definitely, it's rising back up in interest. And so therefore the debate of its value as a part of systems change, helping to clarify the conflation of bio-based and biodegradable and compostables and how that impacts recycling. That's going to be, and that discussion and debate is going to continue this year again and ramp up again. And so we'll be really helping to talk about, how bio-based can be a part of it in a sustainable way, and what we need to consider as a part of the infrastructure policy and consumer engagement in order for that to work. So I think those are a few of the things we're focusing on. There's others, but I think those are the big buckets.
Wow, a busy year ahead and beyond for you.
Yeah, thank goodness I have an amazing team who is really, they're all smarter than me, which is really helpful. And they are really passionate about this work. And so we have an organization who supports this, not just in the U.S., but globally. So it's been, I think we're set up to deliver on everything we want to achieve. So that's great.
I love that, and I appreciate the passion. It really comes through in how you're describing the work you're doing and the goals. So thank you for that. And thanks so much for the important work you're doing around building these complete programs that you've told us about, and working on the pact and the treaty, and really appreciate the fact that you really want to bring all the stakeholders together in the system. And it feels like the momentum's there, and it's really pushing forward, and concrete solutions are coming, and it just makes me so hopeful. So thank you.
No problem. Yeah, we're super excited about it, and super excited about the landscape of really great institutions all working together on this. So it's been really powerful.
Well, good for you, and keep up the great work. And I can't wait to keep following you and your team and watch what else you're doing. So thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share our story.
Well, it's a great one, and thank you again, and I will let you get back to your busy day.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you for listening. It would mean the world if you would take a moment to rate or review this podcast. And if you share it with us, one of our social networks, we are giving out some fun, nothing wasted podcast swag. So just tag us and see what you get. Thanks so much.